Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Please give warm welcome to Roger Hamilton.
This event that we run once a month is called Startup Grind, and Startup Grind started out in Los Angeles or in San Francisco, and then went to Los Angeles, and then grew to 200 cities around the world. It's sponsored by Google for entrepreneurs, and the whole intention of Startup Grind is that it gives startups, tech startups, a chance to hear from founders. Now, tonight, we have David Abrahams, who's going to be talking about more than just, founding a tech company. He's going to be talking about what's the basis behind all tech companies, because, and I'm very curious to hear about this, because he is an expert in rare metals, which you'll find in every mobile phone and in all the technology that we have today. And he also, obviously, has come out here to Bali, so has a lot in common with all of us, and set up Outpost, so also has a lot in common with Genius Cafe in terms of creating a community for all of us entrepreneurs to be able to connect in as well. So we're going to talk about that whole journey, and we're going to have a chance for you to be able to ask questions as well. Because we have a much smaller group today, because of the weather, we are relying on you to have much better questions. So get prepared. And with no further ado, can we please give David Abrahams a big round of applause for being here? Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Roger.
All right. Grab a seat. Grab a seat. I'm just going to have a conversation with David. We're just going to cover a bunch of different topics, and whatever takes your fancy and you think, all right, that's something I want to hear more about, then do ask questions a little later. We'll have a chance to do that. So I'm going to start by just asking you about your pathway that brought you here to Bali, David. What was the kind of steps, and was it an intentional thing, or was it a kind of an accidental thing?
Before I get there, I just want to say I'm very impressed with this place. I mean, I've seen the pictures and the video that you have, but to actually be here in person, and the quality of the food and the atmosphere here, even though it's raining, it still shines through. So cool, I just want to say I'm quite impressed. I wish when you look back in what steps you've taken, you can make a story about it that always makes sense. But to make a story about it when you're going through it, it's a lot harder, and it's a lot harder to make it sound intentional. I've come to Indonesia, I guess the first time was 1998. And I've come back and forth for work-related reasons for several times over that time period. And always was taken by Indonesia, the culture, the happiness, the warmth of the people, the great affection they have towards one another. And so that's been a pull for me. And more recently, I was in 2011, 2012, was writing a book about resources. And Indonesia has an abundance of resources. And I was spent some time here and realized, wow, this would be a great place to sit back and really dig into my research and write. And not only are the resources here, but I think there's the mental space I could find being here. So as I was doing that, I realized, wow, there are other people who may want that same space to create or to build. And between 2010 and today, you saw a number of people increasingly have the flexibility to be productive from anywhere, choosing to do so. So back in 2014, I taught with my now co-founder Brian, decided that we should set up a space for people to be productive.
Were you already spending quite a lot of time here at that point?
In 2011, 2012, I started spending a little bit more time in Bali. The idea came about, but I was still doing the writing. And then back in 2014, 2015 is when we really started to try and identify a place here in Bali.
Right, okay. And that was Outpost?
And that was, yes, the space now is Outpost.
For anyone here who has the idea that they'd like to start their own space up, what would you share in your experience? What were the challenges? What were the rewards of going through that process?
Sure. I think there are challenges to setting up any type of real estate venture. Is the real estate the right location? Is it the right cost? Can we balance that out? And you'll find that whether you're in New York or Sydney or here. But setting a business up in a developing country, a country where you think you may be familiar with the routine, or you've heard things develop slowly, or it's always a challenge to be in a country that's not your own, because you never really have firm grounding. And as much as you try to, that's the main challenges I saw here were expectations I had, but the actual process once I went through it was very different from the expectations.
So at this point, is it, where do you want to take Outpost? Is it doing what you'd like it to do, got the community that you wanted to create, or where do you see it going now?
We're very happy with Outpost, and every day the success that I see when people come here, when people come back,
Right.
And we've been around. We opened last year in April, so about 8 or 9, almost a year. But to see people come back once, twice, because not only did they enjoy Bali, but they found they were really productive here. And that's the biggest reward that I get. And it's wonderful to see that there are people who want to live the lifestyle where not only are they fulfilled with what they do on a day-to-day basis with their job, but they're also enjoying other aspects of their lives. And Bali fulfills that for many people.
Right.
So it's great to see that.
Right.
And we'd like to be able to provide that ability, elsewhere.
So I'm going to get onto your book and also your specialty, but as someone who really is generating, your income you're generating through your expertise and making that decision to come to a place like Bali, obviously life gets easier with communication, everything like that. But for anyone either watching this or anyone here who's saying, hey, I like the lifestyle of Bali. I can get certain business while I'm in Bali if I'm a consultant or if I'm an expert at something, but it is different if I'm in a city and I can hustle the whole time and I can meet. So that whole way that you set yourself up, to what extent did you say, look, I'm already secure. I know I don't have to go chasing any business that's coming my way. Or to what extent did you say, look, that is a risk I run by actually not being right in the midst of things? And because you've also had paid jobs, right, where you've actually in Japan and America were like saying, I'm not going to be having that, or if it is a consultancy base, but I'm going to be remote. What were the biggest considerations and challenges in that, and how did you overcome them?
I think you're right. You identified the trade-offs. If you're not in the city, you're not as close to your customers, or your clients, and that creates a challenge. There's a friction. Distance does that, and it doesn't matter how great the internet connection is. There's always going to be a little bit of friction, and the challenge to get repeat or new business is something that you need to think through when you're overseas. For me, it was a choice that I had a stable lifestyle or a stable income, and I knew I could sustain that. But I wanted to try something different. And there are pivot points in your life. And I spent 7-8 years looking at materials, and I find that that's something I'm going to continue to do forever. Just it's at the moment I'm looking at different business opportunities as well.
Right. Okay. So you can see. So you're looking long term at Bali, or you think this is going to be one place amongst many that you?
I'm Bali. I'm happy with Bali. I
Yeah.
think Bali is a great place for what we're doing, and I think it's only going to the demand for the services is only going to increase. I think people are looking for communities when we travel, and I'm really thrilled about the type of people who come out here. And I think there are opportunities to do that elsewhere. But it really takes a long time to begin to build the name, the brand, the trust. That your place is a place where people can go and feel part of a community and feel productive.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna come down to your specialty, right?
Sure.
And I want to take a step back from it, all from the point of view that I've been watching a lot of the news lately on America and Europe and so on, and my daughter is now, well, one of my daughters is in Scotland, so she's in the whole Brexit thing, and one's in basically Oregon, so right in the midst of the whole Trump thing. And when they hear news, they are like emotionally impacted by it because everyone there is like, what's going to happen next? Whereas in Bali, you can almost watch it and say, well, all right, there's stuff going on, but we're in Bali. So like, if it's going to hit us, it's going to be a ripple, which will take a while. So let's just get on with life. And you're at a level where you're able to see trends and looking at trends at a larger scale. I'd love you to share the trend that you see, which is in your book, The Elements of Power. And so if you haven't read the book, The Elements of Power, it is a fascinating book, and I'd love you to share the basics of what the theme of the book is and
Sure.
why people are wanting to pay you a lot of money to learn more about it.
The life that we live, this high-tech enabled lifestyle, the life that we want to lead, where it's green powered, if you will. We're driving electric vehicles. We're reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Has a lot of resource implications, has economic implications, environmental and geopolitical implications. The reason is because we're not switching from oil and our use of oil and gas in cars, and they're going to be powered by the sun and the wind. We're relying on these metals we haven't thought much about, lithium, cobalt, and dysprosium. And those people who have access and control over these resources are going to have a larger say in the global order as we go forward. And that whether that's a country like China or whether it's a mining company or a processing company. So I spent 3 years traveling the world to get a better understanding of what are the impacts as we make this change. And so that's where my expertise has historically lied in resource use.
And so tell us a bit about TREM, like how TREM works and what your role is in that.
Sure. The Technology, Rare and Electronic Materials Center is a think tank based out of Washington, D.C. And what we do is we educate people, whether those people are in Congress or business, about the resource change that we're seeing, which I elaborated on. And we've hosted conferences or as an aside, done consulting work based on what are the changes going to be when everyone in Indonesia walks around with a smartphone. We see these things and we buy them off the shelf, and they're a consumer product that looks nothing like the resources, the wood and the glass that we see around us. But just like the wood that's around us, everything that we carry in our iPhone came from the ground. It just doesn't look like that. So you have to really appreciate that even though we're going into this high-tech era, that the resources themselves and our lifestyles are just as tied to the ground and the resources that come from it than ever. And in fact, I would argue even more so because of the random places that these resources come from.
So pretty much every massive shift that's happened geopolitically has always happened as a result of whatever is the scarce resource or whoever has ownership on those resources, whether it's iron, whether it's oil, or in this case now, whether it's rare metals, right, and where they are. So what do you see like which are the countries in the world that actually have the greatest deposits and greatest control over those rare metals?
It's China and China. There's because of good geologic good fortune, because they focused on processing these materials. So it's one thing to dig these materials up, but if you were to look at them, they just look like dirt. Like metals, I had this misconception that when you dug up metals, you would see the flakes, kind of like the shiny things, like it was gold. But only really gold comes out of the ground looking like gold. Everything else comes out looking like dirt or sand. And so it's the processing of these materials. And so what China has done is really focus on, if we don't have this material, let's process it. And because these supply chains, because the road that these materials take from ground to our smartphone gets very narrow. And those who control the processing really are the ones who can extract a lot of value or power from that production. And in that case, it's China. Now, Australia has a lot of resources. Chile, Brazil has them as well. But most of the time, the resource supply chain goes through China.
And do you see them taking advantage in a way at the moment, or do you see that happening as it becomes? Is there going to be a shortage? Is there going to be price hikes? What do you think is going to happen, and what are the risks as a result of the growth of technology?
Well, it's important to understand that when we're talking about these rare metals, we're talking about 40 some odd rare metals. And in your phone, there are half the elements on the periodic table. So we're looking at about 60 elements that are just in your phone. So if you don't have one of those elements or one of those materials, then you don't have the smartphone. And that's the challenge that we're getting to. So it's not a resource power in that they're going to maximize the dollar or the yuan value of the production. It's just a question of, in China's mind, is how do we maximize the resources that are coming through our country to produce more of these high-tech goods. So China's very focused on the green economy, and they're very focused on building that equipment domestically. Everything from the production of the mined metal to the production of the wind turbine. And it's a natural progression. Any country that wants to use the resources, just like Indonesia does, wants to use the mined resources to get as much value from it. and China feels the same way. I think one thing that's important to understand is that China, although they produce most of these materials, are also the greatest consumer of them. So it's a power they have not only from the production and processing, but also from the resource, from the actual production of the end product.
What do you see the risks in the new president and his policies right now to all of this?
I think instability will be the constant for the next 4 years. That policies are made in Twitter, policies are made in speeches, and policies are broken in Twitter, and policies are broken in speeches. And the world will be constantly guessing what does it truly mean when the man at the top says something, the people below him say something different, and where truth has all of a sudden become a little bit more malleable. So there's no one, even the people at the top, have an understanding of what's going to happen. I think there's a sense within Washington, with the party coming in, that change is good. And I would agree that change can be good, but change for change's sake, or change made out of spite or a U-turn, is jarring to the international community and jarring to the U.S. So I think those are things that we're going to have to get used to, being jarred and not understanding everything that's going on.
Given that one of the targets is China, and given that China is so pivotal for rare metals, is there any impact within those areas that you see?
Well, you saw back in 2010, there was a territorial flare-up between China and Japan. And back then, in response to actions that China felt Japan took, that they needed to have a political response. And their political response was to halt the export of these rare metals to Japan. Now, Japan is a country that produces a lot of high-tech goods. It relies on these rare metals to a degree that most other countries don't. So when China held back these materials, there was great concern within Japan. I had the good fortune to have ringside seats to what was a troublesome time in Japan, and you could see that Japan had really nowhere else to go. The country was concerned that its manufacturers wouldn't have the materials, and so they capitulated on a lot of concerns because they wanted to make sure their companies had access to resources. Now, this is a card China still has to play. It controls a lot of these resources, and what it's historically done is try to entice Western companies to China's shores to produce because of cheaper labor, lower environmental standards, but also these materials. And so they still have that card. They still produce a lot of these materials, and for a number of reasons, which we don't have to get into the nitty-gritty, that will be a continuing reality, is that China will control these resources for the next 5 or 10 years. So if the Trump administration wants to get into a trade war, these materials can figure more highly.
Got it. So there's been a number of things that some of you might have seen on Facebook, on the social media, around, for example, Elon Musk and Tesla, right? And like, is it a green company? Is it not a green company? On the one hand, he's like, it's meant to be green with electric, but then because of lithium batteries and because of the mining, it's as bad as, extracting oil, right? What's the truth in that? Is there going to be a resource issue with rare metals like there has been with oil, or what's that going to look like? And what's the relationship between sustainability and the focus you have?
Okay. I think in terms of the Tesla and it being less environmentally sound than oil and gas vehicles, I don't think that's the case. But I think what it highlights, and I think people are right to look at, is what is the environmental impact of actually producing the stuff we use. And we think that most of the resources that are going into the product, well, let me take a step back. We see the oil and the gas going into the car, and we understand that, there are fumes coming out. But the greater impact oftentimes is not the use of the product, but actually the production. And I talk about this long tailpipe of our lives is because we buy this shiny new smartphone, and I go back to it because it's easy to see. But the resources and the environmental impact are not from its use. 85% of the environmental impact is from the production.
Right.
So it's important to understand that, and that's what I appreciate people looking into the Tesla and saying, "Wow, there are a lot of challenges," but there are a lot of challenges to build a regular car.
Right.
And I think the conversation people should be having is, oh, does it make sense for me to junk my current car, which gets 30 miles to the gallon, to buy a new fuel-efficient car to get 40 miles a gallon? So it's a net environmental savings. But I would argue, and this is where the people are going in terms of the reporting, that production of that new vehicle
Right.
is that has a higher environmental impact than if you were to continue to use your car for another 2 or 3
So
years.
the recycling process is really critical to this whole thing, right?
So recycling is critical. Reuse,
Yeah.
the longer you can keep the product you have, the greener you are. So you don't need that next good. So you don't even have to think about, what's the environmental impact of a new, just use what you have longer. And that's, can you replace a battery so it goes to last longer? That's the kind of conversation that's more helpful than just looking at, does the cobalt coming from China have an impact on the environment? Yes, it does. But so does the steel that you're getting for your previous car.
All right, I'm going to ask one final question, then we're going to open this up. And this is one which I'm really fascinated by, because there is this whole view of the government, and whether it's the US government, Japanese, Chinese government, which is like you're either going to go work for the government, and if you do that, you're going to be, having to go to Washington, or having to, be a civil servant or a politician, or you could, go get a job, or you can be you can be an entrepreneur, right? What you've done is you become that, the digital nomad, the person that can travel, but a lot of the value you give and even the income you generate is working with governments. It's actually advising them. It's actually, being able to provide at an expert level information they're looking for. And do you see that interaction or link between governments being able to make or not make a difference in the world, and entrepreneurs doing the same? Do you see it being one or the other? Do you see it being very much more like what you're doing, more people getting involved as someone who's a free agent that's able to actually work together with government and with business as well?
I think you can have an impact wherever you are. I think that I noticed when I was in the government, and then I went to an investment bank. And in the government, I was dealing with high-powered issues at a relatively high level. And I was making decisions on issues like trafficking in persons, or funding that was going to Afghanistan and Iraq for police training. I was working on foreign affairs funding. And I was at meetings with high-level decision makers. And I was making very little money, but had a relatively large impact for someone who was 29, 30 on what the government was doing. Then I switched over to an investment bank, and I had a small little cubicle where I could see the sky if I turned just right. And so I was buried in that when I lost my White House view. But my salary was 2 or 3 times larger. And I was informing people who were informing people about making decisions. So I was happy with both jobs. But I realized that you had different impact depending on where you were, and you had to appreciate the impact that you had. And now I'm in Bali, and I set up a co-working space. And I look at part of my success isn't setting up a co-working space or setting up a community, which things I'm very proud of, but the success of people who come through our space. It's how can I empower them? How can I make the connections so that they're able to live the lifestyle that they want to? So you take different things from your career and you set them as goals on how you can influence.
Very cool. All right, I'm gonna open this up for questions. So if there's anyone who has a question, I'd love you to share who you are. Everyone's hands are going up. Who you are, and then what your question be. Shall we come over? And Dee will be able to pass the microphone around to the hands that go up.
My name's Karen. My question is, you've talked a lot about China and the processing and the control of that side of things, but how do you see all that change once we are actually able to mine asteroids and all the minerals and precious metals we can get outside of the Earth's atmosphere?
Sure. I think it's a good question. It's saying the resources that could be around us could be far more valuable than the stuff on the ground. The challenge I have with mining asteroids and deep sea mining, which is also something that people bring up, is mining in general is really expensive. We're talking about billion-dollar investments, and that's here on Earth. That's digging a hole in the ground and bringing up tons and tons of the Earth, huge holes. Doing that either under the sea where it's dark and there's pounds of pressure or thousands of how millibars or however the pressure is measured down there, and it's cold and you can't see things, is a challenge. I'm trying to set up a space program to capture an asteroid and bring it back down to Earth. I think it's too complex for me to see over the next 20 years of something like that happening. It's just a cost issue. I think they're wonderful things to think about, but unless they're flying gold asteroids, I think that no one is going to be able to successfully do that at scale.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bibi. I really enjoyed the conversation so far. I also wanted to ask about asteroid mining, but I have a couple of other questions. One was something that bugs me since a really long time is the question that you kind of went into at the beginning a little bit about how sustainable is sustainable. And so there are companies like B Corps or other kind of certifications that try to assess certain points or to kind of assess the environmental and the social aspects. But how do customers or consumers actually know how sustainable is sustainable, or how do we know?
I think you highlight a real challenge. The reason is because people, and I mean companies themselves, don't know their materials and where they come from. And because Samsung is bringing all of these products together and buying components and putting this component together with that component, they don't know where the component manufacturers get their subcomponents. And the component manufacturers have no idea where the subcomponent manufacturers get their. So people go all the way back. And when you're talking about a car with hundreds of components and subcomponents, is that no one really knows where stuff comes from. And it's not like you're buying a loaf of bread where you can look up the ingredients and get a sense of, all right, wheat and sugar and where they may come from. These are really complex products that are buried in complex products. So it's difficult to understand, and even scientists have to take a guess of what's in these things. If I were to tear a phone apart and try and break out what metals are in there, I would surprise the companies themselves because they really don't know. So that sounds a little bit, if you're trying to understand the impacts of what the life you're living, it sounds challenging, and it is. But I think you can make some common sense decisions about the products that you're using and how you can try and make things last longer and live in a more, and try to get by with less. I think you're better off knowing that you're living a more sustainable lifestyle if you are. And people will always come up and say, oh, did you realize that you're getting a locally sourced product and therefore that you're having a bigger environmental impact because of Y, or why aren't you getting a locally sourced product because, and just in general is just try and consume what you need.
What's your thoughts around, just on that point, on buying decisions? Because we see this all the time where more and more companies now can become more socially conscious because consumers are, right? So we have a choice, and we know, okay, this Tom Shoes is going to give a pair of shoes when we like to buy a pair of shoes. This company's not. I like Tom Shoes, I'm going to buy one, right? So it actually becomes easier now to be able to have a social impact. And there's a book by Daniel Goleman after his emotional intelligence book, the ecological intelligence one, where he was almost predicting at that point the whole idea of blockchain, right? He was already saying in the future people will be able to look and see the quality of a bottle. They can scan it and they'll be able to see where the glass came from and where it was made and who made it and how much it cost. And that's just because technology will be at a point where it's tracking all of that. So, obviously that's probably impossible to do with metals themselves.
Right.
But that whole element about where technology is going and to what extent, we can have tracks on where products all get made. So we're making decisions on that. Do you see that being part of the future we're moving towards?
I think culturally, I appreciate the direction that we're going, in that we want to know more about the stuff that we use. And those are the questions that really drive, especially Western companies, to understand what are the impacts. And people have heard about conflict minerals, which are basically the minerals that are critical to our products that come from areas in conflict. And historically, that's been Africa. And that drive to highlight the inherent challenges we have in collecting our resources is important. The legislation that may come about it is imperfect, but the highlighting of that is important, and it's society to highlight, and that's why you see Western companies like Apple more interested in these products and getting them from sustainably sourced, for lack of a better word, areas. I think what you see is companies in China and to some degree in Korea and Japan are just slowly becoming more interested in where the materials come from, but it's still kind of a don't ask, don't tell type of world for a lot of these electronic companies, when they're all pushing for the bottom line that, all right, if I get this material from X and it's cheaper, I really don't want to know much about it. So I think it's up to us as consumers to really decide what are the products that we want and to use our buying power for that. In the meantime, it's up to those people who make sustainably sourced products to talk about it and why it's sustainable, but also, and just as important, to make a good product. Because as much as you want a sustainably sourced phone, you don't want to drop the call.
Yeah. I'm gonna come back to the questions, but I've got an asteroid type question off the back of that one. We were having a conversation earlier before we started here about this weekend. I'm flying to LA, of all places, this weekend because Peter Diamandis is running a program, and his Singularity University was my first exposure maybe 5 years ago to some of the new technology coming. We had one guy there, I can't remember his name now, but he's professor at Stanford, I believe it is, on nano printing. So 3D printing, but at the cellular level or at the atomic level. And he put up a picture of the periodic table, and he said, this is our canvas. And he showed us the technology they're working at, which they've come a long way on as well, where they could basically print any metal, right? And he said, which one do you think we're starting on? And we thought, well, obviously gold, because then you'd print a lot of gold. And he goes, no, actually it's diamond or carbon, because with carbon we can make as much diamond as we want, and eventually we can make living organisms. And we're like, okay. And the whole focus was on how that would grow. And obviously there's been news recently about now nano printing diamonds, for example, right, which are more perfect than diamonds. Do you see a future before the asteroid mining where it will be possible to 3D print the same atomic structure that the rare materials currently have?
I think it's possible to find substitutes, and I think we're already there with producing substitute or man-made materials that substitute for naturally mined materials.
Right.
Graphite, and graphite is key for batteries. You have synthetic graphite and natural graphite, and so it's already happening.
Right.
It's just a question to the degree. Now, in terms of printing any element, that would be wonderful. So I'm waiting to hear more. So let me know what you hear on the way back.
All right, I'll let you know. Okay, Nick.
I'm going to keep it from asteroids just to this big shiny sun we've got. You mentioned, and it's interesting to hear, that we might not want to all go out and buy an electric car because we've got to wait till our cars are knackered. I imagine there are a fair few scooters on Bali every day that get into that category. If we look at things like Elon Musk and Tesla and the roofing, how are governments working? Are they working to make it really easy to just import 1,000 scooters a day running on solar into Bali and that kind of venture? You know, the tiles, we hear everyone you speak to about Bali, it's impossible getting anything in, anything out. You know, Musk's tiles are not coming till later this year, but when they're out there, when there are these concepts out there, how is it being driven from top down, and is it on making it easier to get access to those?
I think if you look at countries that have had success with, in the case solar, you look at Germany, and it had a heavy government hand in making the purchase and the use of these solar panels something that the everyday person could use. And you saw solar use just drastically increase in Germany. And you didn't see that same response in other countries. So they lag behind. So I think governments have a great ability to enable through subsidies the use of a number of technologies, hopefully green technologies. And they also have ways of discouraging that. And so the open question in the U.S. is what will the U.S. do? And that's a big deal, even if you're not from the U.S., because the U.S. is such a large market. I think you'll see China, to the extent that it can make the switch from coal to alternative sources, once they're able to really produce the materials like the solar panels and the wind turbines and the supporting infrastructure, they can make a large impact too. So governments are critical to get technologies off the ground that may not have an economic rationale for people to become involved in. But we're getting to a point with certain green technologies where they are the better technology. If Teslas were coming around when electric vehicles were kind of jokes, that they were vanity symbols. Now they're vanity symbols with real horsepower.
We have time for one more question. Who would like to ask the question? Final question of the evening. All right, got a hand up over here.
Hi, my name is Nick. I was just curious about, are there any companies that are doing this right?
I think there are companies that are trying to do it right. And I'm going to take Apple because they're going to get compliments for doing it right, and then they're going to get blasted for doing it wrong. And so for Apple, they're looking very deep into their supply chains, trying to understand the impact of everything that they're doing, where these materials are coming from. And they spend time to know that. At the same time, and then they try and make decisions on purchasing and get their suppliers to make more wise decisions on purchasing. They're really trying to impact their supply line. At the same time, my phone dies and I can't change the battery because it's locked in there. I can't pop out the screen. So they've created a great system to understand where their materials come from. And it's going to constantly evolve, and it has to. But they built their phones with a death clock. And if anything happens to it, I have to junk it because of the challenge to change whatever component needs to be changed. And where have we gotten? We've gone backwards. I remember playing NFL quarterback with a 9-volt battery in the back that I could pop out and change in. But now, 30 years later, we don't have the technology to take out an iPhone battery. So there are steps that every company can make to do it better.
So I'm gonna. Did you? No. I'm gonna have. We're gonna be open in a moment for conversation. We're gonna be here to network, connect with some new people. So if you came with some people and there's others you haven't met, do take the time, because we are a more cozy group, to get connected to some others here as well. I'm going to finish on one question around everyone's experience here in Bali. We've talked a lot about technology just because of your background while we've been here, but you come with your own book, and you obviously have things we haven't even talked about, like the nonprofit you work with on the water, clean water. So there's all these different areas that you focused at, and what I'm curious about is the future of entrepreneurship in Bali. I think there's been a kind of categorization over the last 5-10 years on the type of people that are startups, whether it's the digital nomad that will travel from place to place and really value freedom more than anything, whether it is the social entrepreneur that will value making an impact more than anything, or whether it's the tech entrepreneur who's looking to really scale. And we're seeing all three of them come together a lot more. Do you see Bali as being a place that will be similar to what it is right now in terms of people passing through and then moving on, or do you see it actually could become a real hub for entrepreneurship globally?
First, I'd take a step back from the people coming through and say who the people are here.
Right.
And when you look at Java and you look at Bali, this has been a place full of entrepreneurs, people starting hotels and restaurants and having no idea what they're doing, how to serve food, and then 20 years later, they have a huge hotel complex with restaurants, and so the people who we don't see their growth because we go by their fruit stand, but in 5 years, it's so much larger. And so I think there is that enthusiasm here for building things. So I think that's the kind of the ground that foreigners who come here are growing on. And I think that Bali has, as of now, I think it's a great place for people to come to build their ideas, to really network with other people, understand from people who have built things like yourself on what it's necessary to do that. And I think that's what that's the seed that many of the people passing through here have. I think the next step, and I see it happening now, is that the people who are funding projects, the people who are based in California or Singapore, even Jakarta, are now understanding, wait, that the traditional places for finding the next new idea may not just be on a spit of or a cusp of land in California, but it can be elsewhere. And that's what's most exciting to me, is seeing those people who have been receiving funds coming through here, and now people coming out here and then finding funds. So I think it will continue to increase, and Bali will be a home for people who need the space to grow. And I'd like it to be easier for people to come here and then build something.
Very good. Well, on that positive note, I want to say a huge, big thank you to David for being our guest tonight. Can we please give David a big round of applause? David Abrahams, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Very, very cool. Awesome.